After President Kennedy is assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, takes office. He is then resoundingly reelected in 1964 over Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, who was pretty unpopular among the American people. So LBJ sweeps into his own reelection in 1964, feeling like he can get a lot done because he's quite popular at that time. His major domestic agenda is known as the War on Poverty. Piggybacking on President Kennedy's Peace Corps, he forms VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. It's really the same concept, it's just that it stays within the United States. Your public service stays here rather than going overseas. Today, this has been renamed, it's known as AmeriCorps. He also continued the struggle for Medicare, Medicaid, which is medical insurance for the elderly and the poor. President Kennedy had suggested these things. President Johnson was continuing that struggle. He also supported the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as well as the Higher Education Act, both in 1965, approving billions of dollars in spending to aid the states in funding education. So not only is President Johnson attacking poverty where it currently exists through VISTA and Medicare and Medicaid, but he also is trying to get better education for all American citizens so that they can better themselves moving forward. Here is President Johnson signing Medicare and Medicaid into law. There's also a continued struggle for civil rights. Malcolm X is a leader very different from Martin Luther King. He encouraged blacks to fight back against white violence, a direct break from the mainstream civil disobedience policies that Martin Luther King and the NAACP are using. The Black Panther Party is a militant organization that encourages this violent pushback for the oppressive treatment of blacks by white society. They wore a uniform of all black clothing, particularly black leather jackets and belts, as well as black berets. You can see the Black Panther Party symbol on the upper left, a Black Panther Party member on the bottom left, and Malcolm X, this famous leader of this movement, on the right. Baker versus Carr in 1962, although lesser known than other civil rights actions, is pretty important because it says that legislative districts must be approximately the same size. This would allow for blacks to have equal representation because what was happening was white areas were receiving multiple congressional leaders, and then black areas of equal or even more population were receiving fewer congressional leaders. So what this Supreme Court decision said was that every congressional district must be about the same size population-wise. That way it can be assured that everybody is receiving the same amount of representation in Congress as everybody else. You can see this map here, the state of Mississippi, that the congressional districts on a map look slightly different sizes, but the drawing of these lines is not necessarily based on geography, it is more so based on population. So although the smallest looking one on this map in the orange, there's probably at least one city in there that is making it large enough population-wise to compare with what geographically looks a lot bigger in the green portion on this map. But the green portion is probably much more rural areas of Mississippi. The 24th Amendment in 1964 says that poll taxes in federal elections are no longer allowed, that this disadvantages poor blacks. Likewise, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 outlaws discrimination in public facilities, private businesses providing services to the public, and federally funded programs and labor unions. This is a sweeping equality legislation. The Voting Rights Act also specifies that beyond the poll taxes that are being discussed in the 24th Amendment, that also literacy tests and other discriminatory practices are illegal. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act said that the real estate industry could not discriminate against blacks. Here is President Johnson signing some of this legislation into law. The concept of affirmative action. This is very controversial in the late 60s and throughout the 70s when civil rights is finally gained by blacks. Affirmative action is that admission to college or maybe a job hiring gives preference to women and or minorities. In a Supreme Court case, the Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation v. Weber in 1979, a white man sues his employer for denying him a promotion based on his race. Supreme Court says that affirmative action was perfectly acceptable because the company was trying to pursue racial balance. So, very controversial, but affirmative action was a very common practice throughout the late 60s, 70s, and even into the 1980s. It is not so much a practice today. A political cartoon joke, students walking out of the SAT. One saying, "Those SAT questions were brutal, what did you think?" And the other kid, who in the cartoon happens to be black, says, "Well, I got the one where I check off my ethnicity, so I know I aced it." Now, this is a joke. It's not really that extreme. SAT scores are not skewed, but it does show that admission into college may not take those SAT scores as strongly into consideration for a black student as they would a white student. So do not allow this to make you think that SAT scores favor one race over another, because they don't. But a university might overlook a poor SAT score by a minority student and look more at other parts of their resume to get them into school and going to college. Women's rights is also advanced greatly in this time period. Now, in 1966, this is a feminist organization, the National Organization for Women, and it's formed to fight for equal rights for women. The big thing is equal pay for equal work. Women doing the same job as a man should receive the same pay. Also, a big push is daycare centers for working mothers, so that they could have their children watched while they worked. Title IX in 1972 said that no one can be denied the right to participate in a school program funded by the federal government based on their gender. This is where female sports becomes much more widespread than it had ever been before. The Equal Rights Amendment is attempted in 1972. This promoted specific language guaranteeing women's rights. It did not gain enough state legislatures' approval to become a constitutional amendment, however. On the left, you can see the symbol of the National Organization for Women. You can see marches and protests on the right-hand side of the screen. Roe v. Wade in 1973, perhaps one of the single most controversial political topics in the American political system. A Supreme Court ruling said that a Texas law outlawing abortions was unconstitutional because it violated a woman's right to privacy. Now, Roe v. Wade says that women could have an abortion within the first 6 months of pregnancy, but that put it in the final 3 months that a fetus became a person and that you could not receive an abortion after that point. This has sparked much controversy because opponents argue that a fetus is a person much sooner than the beginning of the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. Here's a political cartoon showing just how controversial this issue is. Very rarely, if a person is very pro-life or very pro-choice, are they going to be able to be convinced of the other side's argument being in any way legitimate. A cartoon on the left supporting abortion, a woman's body saying, "My mind, my body, and my choice." And then on the right, a political statement by pro-life people showing a baby that is saying, "I survived Roe v. Wade," hoping to get people's emotions of, oh, there's so many babies being aborted, and hoping to get more people to be pro-life as a result of this political statement. So the question of when is a fetus considered human? This is showing the development of a zygote, which is what a woman's body starts to create after conception. And if you watch this development, by the time a fetus is about 2 months old, this is what it looks like, but this is zoomed in. So if you see this here and what it looks like, it's zoomed in. This is only 5 millimeters long, and it would absolutely not be a viable human life. If this child was to be outside of the mother's womb, it would not survive. And 5 millimeters is very, 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 very small. But it at least shows that if someone is to get an abortion within, let's say, the first month of knowing that they may have become pregnant, this is what you're looking at after a month. So you can look at this chart and decide for yourself. At what point is a fetus considered human? And although this is zoomed in, it's only about 5 millimeters in size. So really, the question is up to each individual to decide. The single most important part of this presentation, you cannot study the Johnson Presidency and the era of the 1960s and the Supreme Court without being asked on the Regents exam about the rights of the accused. It's in all caps with 3 exclamation points for a reason. When you're asked about Warren Court decisions in some of these specific cases, they are dealing with what? Rights of the accused. That is the wording the exam loves to use all the time. In Mapp v. Ohio in 1961, it says that illegally acquired evidence, that is, evidence without a warrant, cannot be used against someone in court. The woman in question here, the police kicked in her door and found incriminating evidence against her, and they attempted to use it in court to convict her, and she was able to get it thrown out because they did not get a warrant before entering her house. In Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, the decision here is that any crime, not just capital crimes, still required that the state provide a lawyer to those unable to pay for one. In Escobedo v. Illinois in 1964, this says that the accused have a right to request an attorney, and any questions answered without granting such a request cannot be used against them in court. So in these 2 very famous examples, Gideon v. Wainwright, a poor man cannot afford an attorney. This says that no matter what type of crime was committed, that a lawyer must be provided to them. And in Escobedo v. Illinois in 1964, Escobedo was requesting an attorney. The police were not giving him that service, and so everything that he said to them before getting an attorney to speak on his behalf was not usable in court. Escobedo in fact confessed, but because his confession was after he was requesting but denied an attorney, it was thrown out and Escobedo went free. And the most famous example is Miranda v. Arizona in 1966. Ernesto Miranda had kidnapped and raped a woman. He even signed a written confession. But the argument in this case was that he was unaware of what his rights even were. So today, you're read your Miranda rights. You have to be told what crime you're being arrested for, that you have the right to not speak, that you have the right to have an attorney present, and that you have a right for that attorney to be paid for by the government if you are poor. So that's why when you are arrested, you are told, so-and-so, you are arrested for such and such a crime. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you by the court. And then the final part is, do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? And if the person answers in the affirmative, you can begin questioning. And only then can you begin questioning. They do have the right to request an attorney at this point. You can see here Miranda on the left in his prison lineup photo. Not a really good looking guy. Then in the center you can see how his attorney dressed him up for trial to make him look like a much more upstanding citizen. And then on the right, Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court, very, very famous for, I'll say it again, the rights of the accused cases. And we will discuss these over and over and over again to make sure that we have this down for the exam. That is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back to the website and take the online quiz. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.